All right, we're getting into it. I'm super excited to have a bunch of awesome guests here today to talk to us about India's early stage ecosystem. If you're not familiar with it, if you've never heard of it before, it's definitely worth knowing more about. And it's very, I think it's one of the biggest ecosystems. And I'll get educated on this. Well, I'll get educated on this in the next kind of 5 minutes or so. But it's one of the most obviously biggest, most vibrant, and also I think most different. I think that when I think of the European ecosystem or the Asian ecosystem, obviously there's lots of different players. But when I think of the Indian ecosystem, I think of it as very distinct and a lot of its own, massive players and massive sources of fundings, different its own mafias, things like that. That I'm excited to get into and to learn more about, with a strong tie, obviously, to Silicon Valley as well, that we'll get into. But before I do that, some quick, I've killed enough time, so I'll go through this really fast. You know me, and you know Sandhill Markets. I would hope at this point we do a lot of these events, cover different ecosystems, cover different trends, different stuff that's really specific. Even coming up, we have an AI dev tools talk is next, and then I think after that we have a straight out of high school or straight to the pros, I think is the title, talking to a couple of founders that went straight from high school to actually being founders of their own startup. So if you check out the Luma, you'll see more of that. If you're signed up for the newsletter, you'll get notified about it. And then we also have a syndicate. So we do some investing. Much more importantly, today, to help me get smarter and help you get smarter about the Indian ecosystem, we have Sajith Pai, VC at Blume Ventures. They're on Fund 4. They're specialized in Indian consumer. I'll let them give better intros. But the main point being that he's been in the ecosystem for a long time. He's been very successful in the ecosystem and done some of his own writing. So if you go to sanjitpai.com or the Indus Valley Report, you'll be able to see some of his thoughts written up there. And we'll get some of that live today. Second, we've got Kushal from All In Capital, also early stage, as mentioned. He's invested over 100 Indian startups, pre-seed and seed, and previously was on the operator side, a CEO of a startup named FirstCheque. And then finally, last but not least, Anmol, and this is someone who Walter knows well and is actually through on the investing side. But Untitled is the co-founder of Untitled Ventures, also early stage, and was actually on the engineering side. Spent some time in the U.S. In the kind of startup ecosystem as an engineer before moving back to India and moving to the other side of the table as an investor. So excited to get his thoughts as someone who's pretty freshly kind of been in both ecosystems as well. So without further ado, I'll let Jesse help me out here and start to get us rolling and get into the more fun part. Hey, everybody. How are we doing? Mics are good. Everyone looks good. I appreciate whenever we do events with investors or founders in India, that the time zone's always interesting. So I appreciate it. I think it's about 9 there, almost 10, or is it 10 now?
9:37.
Nice. Okay. The 9.5 hour change is an interesting one. But I'm excited. I gave really brief intros and not very good ones. I'll say it's on purpose because I want to leave room for you all to do a better job. Kushal, do you want to lead us off with a little intro of kind of your background?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me here. I run this pre-seed fund in India called All In Capital. We are one of the most popular FirstCheque writers in India. Typically lead rounds of under $1 million in companies across sectors. I have now backed about 150 companies across my venture career. And prior to this, I've been part of a early stage company called Upgrad, which is now a unicorn. I was the founding BD head there. And I also run my own company before that. So I spent pretty much my entire 12-year career as an operator, founder, and now an investor. And yeah, hoping to do a lot more in the coming 10. So that's about me. I'll maybe pass it on to Anmol or Sajith.
Anmol, you want to keep us going?
Sure. So I'm Anmol. Thanks for having us. I've spent about a decade in the US. I did my undergrad there, worked at a couple of different startups as an engineer, namely Postmates and Stitch. And during the time, my friend Vedika and I started writing this newsletter on Indian startups during the pandemic. Kind of during the pandemic, we started meeting a lot of founders, investing in a couple of them, and then in 2022, we raised our first fund. Um, and most recently, then I just moved back to India full time and quit my day job in May. So now I've been based in India for the last 3 months
Fresh. Good to be back.
so far.
Good. Yeah, good. Sanjeev, yeah, you want to keep us finish this
Yeah.
up?
Work with a fund called Blume Ventures. You could think of us as first round / true / primary, depending on, I mean, take your pick. So sort of that spot, right? Not always the first check, but sometimes the first, sometimes the second institutional check. Seed / A, sector agnostic. Do a lot of follow-on stuff to what Kushal and Anmol do. They're typically the first checks in. We sometimes mostly come in after them. Sometimes one check more after them. Uh, as for me, late entrant into venture. I know these guys are young, and I was like in my early 40s when I entered venture, and that's a different story in itself. But a lot of it had to do with my writing. I write a lot, and I also bring out this report called the Indus Valley Report, indusvalleyreport.com, and it's an entertaining read, entertaining and enlightening read. And so, yeah, that's me.
Got it. And I think that Sanjeev and I had read that Blume is, I think, Fund 4, right? I think and
Yeah.
Anmol, this is your first fund, and Kushal, is this first fund for you as well?
Yeah, we did $11 million first fund. We'll be doing a second fund later this year.
Great. And I think one of the, or I guess maybe it's a good kind of a good segue into some of the basics around the Indian ecosystem. Well, one, I guess a really easy one from a locations perspective. Where do you, when I think about the U.S., you think about San Francisco and Silicon Valley, kind of, as a duo on the West Coast. Think about New York on the East Coast, and then you've got a bunch of other ones, whether it's Austin, Miami, Seattle. But when you think of like those top 2 cities in India, what are we where are we talking about?
May I go?
Yeah, you can go for it. Yeah, go for it.
So I mean, Bangalore is definitely ahead, and then number 2 is probably Delhi, NCR. These two between them would probably capture anywhere from 85 to 90% of all the action that's happening in India. Then you have a kind of a SaaS hub in Chennai, and then there's a big long tail of there are some companies in Bombay, in Pune, Hyderabad, and so on. But Bangalore and Delhi, the capital region together combined, I would say easily 85-90% of all the action is there.
And for Anmol and Sajith, do you think is it more extreme? And maybe Anmol, you from your experience having been in the U.S. In the U.S., I think that there are clear hubs. There's been an ongoing conversation like during COVID and after COVID, and Miami's a tech hub now, or Austin's a tech hub now. Is there an ongoing conversation in India, or is it pretty is it heavier and more established around New Delhi and Bangalore? Kind of.
I think over the last decade, I think Bangalore is kind of like the established central hub, and I think over the last decade, there's actually been a lot of folks leaving Delhi and leaving Bombay. Like recently, one of the fastest growing unicorns from Bombay, Zepto, just announced they're gonna shift and move their entire company to Bangalore. That being said, I don't think Bangalore is quite as big as San Francisco is to the US ecosystem. It's definitely the majority, but like there's enough happening in Delhi and to a smaller degree Bombay.
Understood. Yeah. Sanjeev, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, broadly true. In fact, when I joined about 6 years back, Bangalore was the leader, but it wasn't the overwhelming leader it is now. And I think over the last 6 years, COVID was a factor, and I think AI is a factor as well. Bangalore has decisively pulled itself away. I think both these factors, that there's such a concentration of machine learning AI talent in Bangalore, which is there to an extent in NCR. We one part of NCR is National Capital Region. So think of Delhi as a bit like DC, just like you have Maryland and Virginia. We have two big states next to it, and so the cities at the edge of those form what's called the National Capital Region. So that's why it's called Delhi National Capital Region. So it's a sprawling center. So one of the hubs, Gurgaon, has a few unicorns and it's got some machine learning talent, but otherwise, Bangalore's got great weather. Great weather. So we're just in Delhi. We're just jealous of it.
It's the Palo Alto. It's conveniently beautiful.
And the other negative of Delhi is that the pollution's really terrible here. So for health reasons, a lot of people end up moving down south.
Yeah, understood. Understood.
I think, but I broadly agree with Sajith. Bangalore pulled away in the last 5 years for sure. I was a Bombay resident all my life. I shifted to Bangalore late last year because I was tired of taking 2 flights to Bangalore every month. And all my friends moved here. Like towards the end of my stay in Bombay, there was nobody left to call for a farewell party. So the last man standing, and finally decided to pull the trigger and shift to Bangalore. So yeah, that's definitely the trend here.
Just to kind of stay on some of the basics here, right? So kind of setting the stage geographically, and then when we think of, I think in the U.S., there's some big, like you think of, big late stage startups and companies that kind of exemplify the startup ecosystem. I feel like an Airbnb comes to mind, or like a Stripe comes to mind, or obviously like in the older guard, like a PayPal Mafia that then turned into a bunch of other. In the Indian ecosystem, there's a similar dynamic, is my understanding, but obviously they're different companies. What are companies that come to mind? And I think that maybe an interesting exercise would be to try to equate it. And if you think it's not possible to equate it, it's different, definitely bring up that point. But I think maybe to break it down, a PayPal, like maybe the PayPal of India being an older, like one of the first, maybe .com era big winners that spawned, a big group of now very mature, founders. And then another kind of step down from that, I think that you can think of like an Airbnb. So like a younger, not as old as a PayPal, like still kind of ran its course a bit. And there's, the Airbnb, people who have flown out and, fallen out of Airbnb into new things. And then a final maybe name to equate to would be like a Stripe or even a SpaceX, or something that's still private and still technically a startup, still technically a startup despite being massive and spawning its own and being oftentimes a great place to spawn to poach talent from, whether you're a startup recruiting engineers out of Stripe. So are there names in startups in the Indian ecosystem that you feel fit similar molds? And Kushal, I think we can start with you, if I don't, not to put you on the spot. I know it's kind of it's not necessarily the most straightforward question.
No, sure. There definitely are some patterns like that. I think Flipkart has been a bellwether sort of company in India. Lot of talent sort of sprouted from the Grow founders is another, that's kind of the Robin Hood of India. They came out of Flipkart, and there are many more. Like at least I think probably 10 plus companies that would be actually 50 plus startups would have raised like seed rounds out of Flipkart easily. Grow is the one unicorn which comes to mind, but I'm sure I'm missing someone else. Flipkart is
for instance, Slices.
Slice is also Flipkart, yeah,
unicorn
portfolio company also. So Flipkart has been, I mean, they did this startup thing way before it was cool, and they had this massive payout event in 2017 or 18 when Walmart bought them out. It was India's largest acquisition, I think, for $16 billion. And a bunch of people obviously made money there and then went out to start their own companies, start angel investing in their peers. A lot of them went on to become partners at VC funds. So Flipkart for sure was one big sort of bellwether company like that. Another one that comes to mind is Freshworks in the Chennai ecosystem. Freshworks and also Zoho. The Freshworks founder himself came from this bootstrap SaaS company called Zoho, which now does 500 million plus in ARR. Freshworks went on to then list on the Nasdaq couple of years back. I think it's valued at about $3 or $4 billion now, publicly traded. A lot of folks have left Freshworks and started company. Like we backed a company called Rocket Lane, where the founder was ex Freshworks, Revenue Hero. There were a bunch of other companies that that came out. The SaaS talent, especially, is like super concentrated and very dense in that Chennai ecosystem, in the ex Freshworks, ex Zoho sort of circles. These two, I would say for sure, and then there are smaller networks in each city. Like I think there are company networks as well. Like IIT Delhi is probably the Stanford of India. Like all the big unicorns, like the Flipkart founders, Zomato founders, Meesho founders, Snapdeal guys, they're all IIT Delhi graduates. And I guess Bits is pretty popular too. IIT Bombay as well has done very well, but IIT Delhi for some reason like has sort of sprouted probably the most number of unicorns. That's one more kind of mafia that exists here. But yeah, company wise, I would say to summarize, Flipkart, Freshworks, these two are probably top of the pack, and then there are a bunch of other smaller companies too, which have spun out a lot of startups.
Yeah, and Anmol and Sajith, and some names that feels like a solid mapping, and I feel like in terms of very high level, I feel like the Flipkart being like the really a really big one, and then I'll touch back on this in a second, but the IIT New Delhi being a Stanford comparison, I think is an interesting one. I have follow-up questions for that.
I've not heard that, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah.
I guess like I think the college network seems a lot stronger in India than in the US. I think like people kind of tend to invest and congregate around their universities, be it the IITs or the BITS or the IIMs, which are the top tier management institutes. And then on the company side, I think there's also like a couple like smaller networks in Delhi with Paytm, which is one of the biggest financial services company. They're kind of like the Square Cash for India plus. And there's been a lot of great fintech founders starting wealth tech companies or lending companies or investing companies that have come out of that ecosystem as well.
Sanjeev, as someone who's been investing now for, I think you mentioned you joined Blume 6 years ago, have you seen that a lot of these names that we've thrown around, have you seen any trends or shifts there, or is some of the things, again, to pull out some main points, Flipkart Mafia and some other kind of big names, the New Delhi, Anmol kind of double clicked on the investing around schools as kind of a theme, an ecosystem centering there, both on the founding, and I would suspect founding teams, as well as the initial starting supportive investors. Any changes, maybe post COVID, because you've got a really nice window actually of having joined before COVID, invested, deployed through COVID, and now being on the other side as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of the statements Anmol and Kushal made. All I would say is the mafias, the truest sense, haven't really emerged in the way what you see in the US. Like, for example, PayPal had, like, for example, Javed Karim and Chad Hurley wanted to do YouTube, which is, I think, much bigger than PayPal, and like, the Keith Raboy, Reid Hoffman. I would say, like, I don't think Grow is the closest, if there is, from Flipkart. And Flipkart, just because it's the oldest, might have the most. There's Rajan of Slice, two fintech unicorns.
Phone
but
Pay.
Other than Phone Pay, yeah, kind of incubated there. So it's I thought of it, but it's kind of incubated, kind of, So I would say, like, it was acquired by them, and then fair, Phone Pay. So I think Flipkart's the closest. Strangely, all three are fintech, not e-commerce. Interesting. So I think we'll start seeing some of these emerge, but none of the ones which have come out, other than the ones from Flipkart, have become unicorns or even sunicorns. They're all just series A. Like Rocket Lane out of Freshworks is probably the most valuable company that's come out of the Freshworks mafia. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it's just a 180 million post or 160 million post. So it's not very large. And So I think I think Indian ecosystem is still young relatively, right? I would say the key thing that happens is that the investors who've kind of I mean, where what I see is that there's a lot of dark deal flow that happens, right? The investors who've kind of invested in, for example, Urban Co. Urban Co is a company which is sort of a very unique Indian company, like Task Rabbits of the world. Like, they kind of have beauticians coming to your house, or massage, and all kinds of electrical handymen coming to your house for anything. And that sort of is a good company because a lot of operational excellence there, and sort of good founders coming out of there. And typically tends to be dark deal flow for the investors there. And one of the things that I've seen is I don't think there's a mafia the way it's there in the US, but it's sort of a mafia that's been created by supply, like sort of investors and founders investing in them and kind of creating this thing. So I don't think I've really seen true big breakout stories yet. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to define mafia that I haven't thought of it in that way before, where maybe you're not really a true mafia until it gets bigger than the place that, like, because when you said with PayPal, right, there's a lot of those businesses have gone on to be bigger or more successful or bigger in different ways in different places than with when you would describe, when I think of an Uber, that term mafia kind of gets thrown at like any big tech company, and then any talent that comes out of that is then like a mafia, compared to the true maybe definition of mafia should be that.
Close again is Flipkart. So Flipkart's bigger. PhonePe actually. Now PhonePe was a kind of an interesting company. Flipkart acquired them very early, and then they spun them out. So I think it is a mafia, no doubt about it, and they're pretty big.
So Flipkart counts. So we're going to count Flipkart as the first.
Flipkart, and PhonePe and Walmart got it as a steal. Like they purchased Flipkart for like 18 billion or change. And I don't think they valued PhonePe much. And PhonePe today would be more than maybe 10-15 billion dollars. So easily, I think.
But I was just looking this up, and the Spinny founders are also, one of them is also ex-Flipkart. So there's two unicorns.
Is it? Yeah. There you go.
In Pocket FM is a Flipkart founder, which is a unicorn of sorts. So you can say maybe 3 of them are there already. Apart from Growth, 2 more. There's a bunch of folks who don't realize are ex-Flipkart because they did their Flipkart time in 2010, 11, 12, and then did something else. And even CureFit, again, Ankit and Mukesh started it again ex-Flipkart. So it's only 4 now, you could say. I agree with Sajith that it's probably not as big as the PayPal mafia. PayPal spun off, like SpaceX itself is a 100 billion company. YouTube is on its own probably 100 billion plus. So India doesn't have those kind of success stories yet. Hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah. And since you mentioned it in terms of it being a younger ecosystem, which absolutely, it seemed, but it's interesting to draw parallels to the trend line, what we've seen play out. One of the things, again, kind of staying on the basics, and I think maybe as we hit the halfway mark, we can start to dig a little deeper on things. Someone said, Flipkart founders, did it before it was cool. Startups before it was cool. I think obviously, the same, and startups have gotten cool in the US. I think, there was a period not so long ago, like maybe when my dad was in school or coming out of school, that it wasn't something that you would necessarily tell people proudly. If you're working at a startup or a small technology company, no one's going to give you a high five about it the way they do now, right? You come out of, Stanford or some fancy school and you go and work at a startup, it's not a big surprise. No one's surprised that you're doing it. It's kind of the sexy thing to be doing. In India, I would suspect maybe there's a similar timeline, or maybe, a little delayed, but similar transition of whether or not it is cool to, work at a startup. Can you all talk to me a little bit about that timeline? Places like IIT New Delhi maybe being an interesting place to think about, graduates, from there, where they headed. But yeah, I guess I'm wondering when it became cool to do startups in India.
No, I definitely remember before I left for my undergrad in 2014, and at that point it still was not very mainstream. It was
Yeah.
not like very looked up towards. And then since I've been back now, it's definitely kind of cool. Like, I think the other major contributor to how startups were popularized in India was we had Shark Tank launch here a couple of years ago, and despite the successes or failures in the US, like it seems like that's really kind of gotten the word startup and startup founders across the country in a big way that we haven't seen in the mainstream prior to COVID.
So I would pick at least in the US, there was when the social network came out, that was a big inflection point for startups
Yeah.
going mainstream. In India, there was kind of a mini boom in 2015. Before 2015, the business press, right, like Economic Times, Mint, they would never feature a startup story on the front page, which is not really something people talked about. That year, Flipkart raised $1 billion, and I distinctly remember the headline when the Flipkart raises $1 billion, and for me, like that year was when it became like, okay, people woke up and said, oh, something interesting is happening here. And then I think it really accelerated in 2021. Post COVID, there was a slew of activity in venture in India. So yeah, two sort of inflection points. 2015 is where I think the first kind of mini boom happened. Then there was a bust cycle for around 2017, 18, 19 were pretty bad years. And 2020, 21 again were boom time years. And 21, as Anmol said, Shark Tank launched and that cemented it. There was a kind of a mini social network equivalent phenomena in India. Also, there was a web series called The Pictures, which launched here in 2015, which became quite popular. And like funnily enough, they did their second season at the next boom cycle in 21. So every time there's a new next season of Pictures comes, I'll remember to sell everything I own.
Good. Good timing. Good timing. Sanjeev, yeah, how do you feel about, I mean, I think again, interesting, timeline for your investing career, post COVID, before the boom cycle, as Kushal put it, and after. Does that all kind of ring true for you, or do you feel like there are more people in the ecosystem, distinctly more, maybe different types of founders now than there were before?
Yeah, for sure. Different types of founders. Uh, I think when I kind of just before I joined, perhaps it was dominated by certainly the elite engineering colleges, IIT, BITS, and a few more elite regional colleges, kind of less known outside the US, but well known in India. I think it's got democratized to a certain degree, where you start seeing people from like humanities colleges, etc., like SRCC, which is a very elite college, not an engineering college, but they teach commerce and economics. So you started seeing grads from there. There's a few colleges like that. So certainly that's democratization has happened. It's not like it's still dominated by the engineering college grads, but there's still a lot more so women, for instance. So there's certainly that. I would say, like, from what it was when I joined, like, or just before I joined, which was male engineering undergrads who had worked in tech companies. There's a lot more democratization. We have a lot of consumer brands happening, and which there are a lot of women founders there. So I would say, like, there's a very funny line in a book called The Golden Tap. It sort of looks at all the excesses of the Indian startup ecosystem, published mid 2016 by a Valley founder who lived in India. It's entertaining, and it says Lee Fixel, who is the Tiger kind of investor, says he looked for double-digit JE ranks, and they're very hard to get. It's like people who do Math 55 in Harvard, right? Like, typically folks like that who are like extremely bright and eggheads, and looked for being from what was it, the Marwadi community, which is like a community known for like business acumen, right? So he would look for these two criteria. Did they have a double-digit JE rank, and were they Marwadis, or was it Baniyas? I don't know. Maybe a
Bhagia,
particular
yeah.
caste. Bania. Sorry. So the Bania caste. So it's a caste. So it's a bit, there's a trading caste, and they have very strong business acumen. And if you look at all the like for example, the Flipkart founders, the Ola founders, they're all from that community. So thankfully, it's got democratized a lot, and we kind of have a lot more broader things. But early on, the Indian market was still very narrow, like narrow set of founder basis. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And I think again, there's so many kind of lines to be drawn to the US ecosystem, and back when there was a whole period of time where doing a startup on the East Coast just wasn't even. No, why would you do that? Who does that? It's not. It's unheard of. And everyone was from Stanford and was investors from Stanford. Investing for engineers from Stanford, and then humanities. That same sort of process seems to be the sign of an evolving ecosystem. As we kind of, and I want to circle back on some of the, actually, you mentioned the engineering talent and moving into humanities. I think that there's parallels or conversation to be had around India generally, moving out of just purely being thought of as an engineering talent hotspot, and moving into other parts of obviously the startup stack, let's say. But before that, I wanted to touch on some specifics around like funding, and some of the when we think about a seed, Series A, Series B kind of timeline in the United States, and where that may or may not be similar to valuations, milestones, and things that we think of in the Indian ecosystem. I think so one, I think maybe I'm trying to think about the best place to focus us there, but really, if you could picture me being a founder, I'm an Indian founder. I have an idea, or I'm thinking about going down this path, and I'm asking you all what I need to do in order to kind of hit my milestones, right? Maybe pre-seed, and that could just be have the right background, or seed. Maybe there's some revenue targets you should be expecting to give up certain amounts of equity, and then up to A, you need to be hitting. And I know that these are ranges that move, and there are exceptions and all of that, but if you were going to be giving your friend who's thinking about going down this path, and you want them to be as wide-eyed and kind of understanding the path that they're going down as possible, what are some of those, again, as specific as we can be, what are those kind of things? And I think, Kushal, maybe you're a good person to start for us on the pre-seed and the FirstCheque side. What are you looking for in that founder? And if there are metrics, or there's certain amounts of traction or not traction, I think those are all interesting points. I think maybe you muted. Let's see.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'll borrow a term from Sajith, and I would classify founders into VC fluent and non-VC fluent. So there are people who can speak our language, tell us what is a TAM, SAM, growth rate, churn rate. They basically know how to pitch a VC. These guys typically come from the startup ecosystem. They would have studied at one of the IITs or one of the premier colleges, or worked at a startup which has raised VC funding, and spent time with people who have raised VC funding. These guys are pretty good at articulating their vision, and they usually are able to raise money pre-product, pre-launch on day zero. Not a large sum of money, but at least let's say $500,000 is pretty doable for somebody who's from the ecosystem and who knows the language. If you're an outsider, then I've seen people struggle to kind of communicate, what they're building, what is their vision, and why is this a VC backable company. So those folks tend to have to work harder, show a product, have some traction, and then they're able to hit a first fundraise. If you're extremely fluent, like say you were a VP at Flipkart, or one of these storied unicorns, then you might even get a $2 to $3 million check on day zero, before you execute anything. What we look for, most of our deals are actually pre-product. At least I would say 50% of them are, and about 70% plus would be pre-revenue. So what we look for is this a real problem? How unique and how differentiated is a solution that this founder brings to the table? What is their unique right to win in this market? We like these founders whom we call earned secret founders, where they've done something in their lives which exposes them to a unique problem and solution, which is not very common. Like we found at a space tech company called PureSight, where the founder spent 10 years at ISRO, which is India's equivalent of NASA. So he came with a very unique, problem statement and a solution to that problem. So we love those kind of founders, and we are happy to back them like pre-product, pre-launch on paper plans. But we also sometimes when we just too soon, if we feel the founder is not fluent enough, or maybe we are not able to understand their vision yet, we'll wait it out, and then do the deal once the company has some revenue or some early traction. Like let's say maybe if it's a SaaS company, I'll probably look at it once it's doing at least like about 50K in ARR. That's the range where we would probably get interested. Yeah, but there's no hard and fast rules as such. Broadly, with or without traction, what we look for is this a real problem? What is the solution to this problem? Is it a differentiated technology-enabled solution which can build some kind of moat around? And the caliber of the team, like why do we think this is the right team for this problem? And of course, how large is the market? Like we want to see a path where this company can get to 100 million plus revenues in a few years. So all of these things have to line up, and then if they do, we are happy to invest. So yeah, that's how we look at it. And to a founder, I would say it's probably, if I compare it to the US, I've had friends who have raised money in the US versus people who have raised money in India. It's probably a little tougher here. Culturally, I think the nuances are a bit different. The risk taking, I would say, it's getting better in India. It's probably still far behind the US. But yeah, it is getting better. There are, like for example, the college I come from, BITS. There's this guy called Aves whom the Blume guys have funded. He raised money for a satellite company in his fourth year. And now he's raised about $60 million. I think he's 25, 26 years old. Satellites are up in the sky. So these kind of ambitious plans are also getting funded in India. And I feel like usually if the founder is not able to raise money, it's because they don't know how to sell their story yet. So India has gotten to that point where if you're half decent at articulating, you have a good background, you should be able to raise at least $500,000 to get started.
Yeah, no, interesting. Or Anmol, I'll let you. I'll let you, because I think and Sajith, I want to ask you kind of about maybe a little bit after that, after the FirstCheque. But Anmol, does that all ring true in your kind of experience?
We invest largely at the same stage as Kushal, and we've kind of co-invested in a couple of companies as well. So it's usually kind of the founder, why they have the right to win in the space. I think depending on the space, we look at things slightly differently. Like, for example, like one of the spaces we've historically looked at very closely is enterprise software, and like the kind of marquee has been like Indian software companies trying to come to the US to sell, and historically quite a few companies have struggled with it. So over there we largely look at like what is this founder's actual ability to come and set shop in the US or figure out a go-to-market strategy to be selling in the US. I think the only sector where we've ourselves kind of invested post revenue, even at the super earliest stages, is with consumer brands in India, because you've seen companies doing like $40,000 to $50,000 in monthly sales, going out to go raise like a couple $100,000, and usually like they've bootstrapped it to a point and don't need any external capital to get there. So I think that's kind of the only nuance where we've invested post revenue. And then for folks who are kind of like are second time founders, or they're very fluent in the ecosystem, as Sajith puts it, they're kind of off the bat kind of end up skipping the angel or pre-seed round, and they go raising 2, 3, 5, 20, 30, and kind of we've had a lot of that in the last couple of years, and even this year. So as I guess the other thing that's happened is firms like Blume have kind of become much larger, and the typical seed A firm has a lot of capital under management, where they go and write much larger seed checks now to kind of back those second time founders, or back some of the companies that Kushal or I would have backed who've got into some kind of traction.
Yeah, Sajith, so you're eating the second time founders. They're skipping the small rounds. They're going straight to you.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's a big market. They're just having fun at my expense. So just to give context, it's worth keeping in mind that if you take the Indian seed It's much smaller than the US one. I was just reading or listening to a podcast. Michael Kim of Sandana, which is a fund of funds, he was talking to on a podcast, was saying the average, the median seed kind of round in his portfolio of funds is 4 million on 18.5 post. Now, that is not a seed round in India. That's a Series A in India, right? His pre-seed, which is 1.5 on 8.5 post, is the typical Indian seed, and the pre-seed's even smaller. So you could just look at it and say, in India's A is US seed, India's seed is US pre-seed, and so on, right? Like, so it's a much smaller market for that. For that. I do feel a good way to understand the Indian market is to break it into two parts, really, to see them as, is it a second-time founder? If it's not a second-time founder, is it at least a fluent-ish first-time founder, which is sort of an operator from one of these unicorns, etc. If not, then you need to show a lot of what we call traction. Else, we can do a little bit of what's called formation check. And yes, all funds like ours have got greedy. We see signals and signals of how fluent the founder is, and we try and go in. But really, I would put it this way: it depends on a lot of factors. Like, for example, if it's a founder from one of these, let's say an urban company, and he's starting in a completely different category, like fintech, then I probably am going to say, hey, you know what? It's a different space. Why don't you raise money from one of these good, like a Kushal or folks like that, and then come back with some traction, and we'll take a look at it. So lots of nuances there, and all I would say is that you'll have to kind of see two markets really. Just like in the US, there's a second-time founders market or a fluent founders market. There's a fresh founders, and the fresh founders market, you really need to show high traction to really to kind of have any chance of closing, and even there it can get pretty brutal. But yeah, it's a big market, and lots of VCs today. The pre-seed.
Yeah, I think the other place where I kind of like differed from the US is like you don't really have kind of like an engineer from Stripe going out and raising like a couple of $1 million off of memo in India. I don't think we've kind of got into that stage of risk appetite at the
for a brief year in 21 that happened. Everything happened.
Well, I think and maybe that's a sign of things to come. Do you think that the Indian ecosystem will continue to progress in that direction, or do you think there's a reason why, maybe just because the market is smaller, like I mentioned earlier, right? Like maybe because of the size of the market just being smaller, that it'll always be a bit like an Indian seed is a American, US pre-seed. Do you think there's a ceiling given the TAM, or do you think that it will continue in that direction, and maybe a decade from now we will be hearing about that?
Yeah. So we had a second-time founder, Manisha, who started a company in the sales tech SaaS space called Sift Hub. She's a founder. She founded a company called Loginext, and we paid up. It was 5 on 25 post. So that's like a US seed.
YC. It's a Y Combinator seed. It's an West Coast seed.
Yeah. So it's a second-time founder who's kind of had built a company to a certain meaningful scale. So it reflects that. So I would say you really have to parse it. You have to unentangle or unbundle out these two, and you would find that maybe for the fluent second-time founders, it's kind of a little more closer to the US one. It's really because most of the transactions are for founders. It kind of comes down.
Yeah. No, interesting. And one thing, kind of in this conversation of all these different, different funds, different VCs, and we're ultimately looking at these deals. One of the things that I've had conversation, and we've been lucky to invest in a few Indian founders that have most out of the YC community, who have then moved back to India after YC and are building kind of on the ground there. Even for companies that ultimately have international and one of them is more consumer than the other. But I had a conversation with one of them a while ago about, and they're thinking about, I think they're Series B actually. They're thinking about their Series B, and they're talking about the U.S. investors versus Indian investors. And as a YC alumni, he's very much, and he was a Stanford grad as well. Is in the scene. He's in the scene in the U.S. But has also had, his business is based in India and serves India, is a consumer facing Indian product. And it was an interesting conversation about who he would want, like what's the goal here, who you targeting. And he was really much more interested in Indian VCs. Because they understand the market, they understand, what he's doing, and that's not because U.S. VCs aren't interested in him. The U.S. VCs are interested in him as well, but ultimately, they're going to be beat out by Indian VCs of similar caliber, say similar terms or whatever. And I thought that was very interesting because I don't think of Europe in that way. I don't think it's the same. I think that felt, when I think of other emerging markets, Latin America, Europe, it feels like, the big tier ones like Sequoia or whoever would still have like a considerable hand up on the tier one of the local tier one. But in India, it felt like the tides had turned, or the scale of power had turned towards the local VCs. And the other headline I'll throw at that is that some of the U.S. firms that looked to create, Indian on the ground Indian arms had to split them out. Like they actually decided, like, this is actually really a separate thing. You're going to go do I think this was, Sequoia India really specifically who did that. Am I misreading that? Do you find that to be, and basically the larger point being that the Indian ecosystem feels more insular than other, quote unquote, emerging markets, in the way that founders and VCs are, will, say no to a foreign VC, even if they're very fancy and have great, track records and more money and whatever it might be. Does that seem, and I feel like Kushal and Anmol, I feel like on the pre-seed, maybe there's one story, and then at the A Sanjeet, I feel like maybe there's a different story. Kushal and Anmol, I feel like maybe it's more obvious on the pre-seed level because it's just more boots on the ground than the later rounds where, a Tiger might come in or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, at the pre-seed, or go ahead, Kushal.
So I'll take it. So I feel like I would push back on that a bit. I also feel US investors have been a bit fickle when it comes to investing in emerging markets.
Mm-hmm.
In one, there was a slew of activity. Bunch of companies were raising even the $1-2 million. Like Tiger actually did a seed round in India in a company. They put in $2 million. It was like just crazy. But that happened. So forget Tiger. There were a bunch of micro VCs in India. I remember there was a deal that happened in Pakistan of all places. There's a company called Airbound there which raised $60 million. With all the troubles that the country is facing, even they got money. Right? So in 21, the US venture ecosystem just ballooned so much that they went out of their way to do deals in LATAM and in Europe and in India and in China, and wherever they found decent opportunities, they went and invested. And then there was a heavy contraction after that. I know of friends in the US who actually Tiger itself. Someone there told me that they deployed $1 billion a month in India in 21. They then deployed $100 million a month in 22, and then zero after that for like 12 months, zero. So that was, I thought, a very good sort of pattern of what the other VCs also did at maybe a smaller scale. The other issue is, I think, Silicon Valley VCs, when they see an Indian company raising money without an Indian VC on board, they get suspicious. Or, what am I seeing here that others are not, and like, what am I missing? So we've seen this often enough. In fact, like, they'll take a meeting, they'll talk to the founder, everything checks out, but they'll just not have the confidence to pull that trigger because they feel they don't understand the market well enough. And which is true. There are a lot of local nuances about the country which they just wouldn't know about. So for example, like, it's not a VC example but a good parallel would be my wife used to work at a streaming service in India called Hotstar. and there was a CEO who was hired briefly who was was back from the US. In India, cricket is by far the biggest thing ever. Like everybody tunes into cricket when the tournaments are on. And this guy came on and he said, "Why aren't we focusing on Wimbledon?" And Wimbledon's going on, and the whole team was just staring at him like, "Dude, nobody cares about Wimbledon in India, right?" So that's kind of the vibe you get from a foreign VC where they just don't have this local nuance for consumer investments. Some of them do, like of course, people who maybe grown up in India and are now in the US, they would probably still understand the country way better than somebody who was brought up in the US. But Indian founders also see this when they go pitch them. They will often realize that these guys just don't get what I'm doing. So I think VCs in the US, once they have time to educate themselves about the market and the opportunity, as the company goes from A to B, they become more confident, and then they see Indian VCs participating. Again, that adds to their confidence. And typically around B or C is where they probably get uh, the courage to pull the trigger in the normal year, which is like not 21. So I would sort of paint it like that. Indian founders, I don't think I have an issue with raising. I mean, honestly, most founders are in the beggars not choosers category. So anybody gives them money, they'll take it. That's whether India, US, wherever you are. Right? The first term sheet you get, if you don't have any other alternative, you'll take it. Very few founders would have an option where they have multiple offers and they can choose whom they want to go with. This is like elite one top 0.1% stuff, right? So that happens when probably let's say somebody raises a seed from a stellar name like Blume, and at Series A they get 2-3 offers. Maybe they choose an Indian fund over the US one, but that's rare. Like mostly people like just barely get one term sheet and then they're very happy they got that. They'll take it from whoever they're getting it. So this resistance, I think, in my view, more from the investor side than the founder side.
Yeah, interesting.
I like largely agree with Kushal that like I don't see a lot of American firms, at least in 2024, trying to invest at the pre-seed or largely even the seed. In India, I think like what happens every cycle in India is everyone gets super excited about India and they come and pour in a bunch of money and they aren't patient enough to see the companies mature and cycle, perform, and then take the next flight out. I think we've seen this like at least in 2008 and 2011, 2015, 2021. So maybe it's also kind of like Indian founders are maybe a little tired of non-patient
Yeah. You can
capital
only
from the-
you can only pull that move so many times. And if you're really looking, and I understand what Kushal is saying also, where the having the choice isn't rare. Also, if Tiger comes in and wants to give you $100 million or whatever it might be, it's easier. Maybe there's the emotions of it don't come into play as much. But that is interesting, kind of over time. You do it enough times, and if you do have the choice, and maybe it's makes the Indian ecosystem a little bit more robust in that you're not looking to be supported externally. There's plenty of growth internally. Sanjeev, do you agree? Is that kind of a similar experience?
Where I've seen is that there is a cherry picking strategy that most of the top US funds kind of have adopted, where they feel that they don't have to be necessarily present fully in a country to kind of take advantage of it. So whether it's Khosla Ventures, which is invested in Sarvam AI, or Healthify Me from our portfolio, or even a small company like Appliance, or and you name it. A16Z hasn't invested. Sequoia, of course, is going through its divorce, so it'll probably come back. Mm-hmm. But if you take, for example, General Catalyst acquired an Indian fund. So they're looking to do more in India. Then, for example, USV invested in its first Indian company. Okay, yeah. And True Ventures invested in another. Okay, so they're all looking. They are cautious. They probably will do where it matches their thesis. Like climate was an important one for both USV and True. So if it is like a fintech focused fund like Ribbit, like for example, they do play in fast growing Indian fintech companies. So I think it's all to do with, does it fit my thesis? Can I cherry pick like the best? I don't necessarily have to come there. Tiger, of course, has I don't think they're boots on ground, but they kind of cover India. They're like the most infamous example. They've come into India two kind of vintages, 11 to 14, very aggressively, and then again from 19 to 21, and after that they've kind of stayed away. So I would say the other one is Indian companies are looking to kind of like SaaS companies looking to kind of tap the US. Like
Mhm.
Rocket Lane, for instance, raised from 8 VC. Okay. And there'll be many more names of Indian companies, like, which are kind of raising, like some raised from even at the seed stage from Storm Ventures, Emergent. Like these are smaller funds. Typically have 1 to 2 partners. Like for example, forgetting the name, I think it's Foundation, Sugar. His strategy is to tap into the IIT Indian Engineering Network, and that's like there are VCs in the US who just tap Israel, for instance. Like I'm
Mhm.
going to tap, like maybe even narrower. I'm going to tap 8200, like this elite, like army, like the military wing, and I'm going to see who's
Yeah.
coming out of that. It's almost like that. So I think there's just cherry picking going on. So I think for every Sequoia matrix divorce, it's not divorce, but whatever you want to call it, there's also a general catalyst looking to kind of buy into India. Axel itself was a purchase of an Indian fund. So I'd say like it's kind of nuanced. I think what you're saying, I kind of get the sense of where you're coming from, that there is a sufficiently deep enough Indian market. And if you're in, like, say, a fintech space or a local e-commerce space, you want to get like an Indian VC who will help you navigate some of these things, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if it is like SaaS, cross-border SaaS, like climate tech, where you'd be happy with a. And finally, look, it's to do with capital. If the US VC gives you capital, the Indian, like Kushal said, I think beggars can't be choosers or whatever. Founders will take it. Like,
Yeah.
it really doesn't matter. But like at a certain stage, money has no religion.
We're coming up on time. I wanted to give one last kind of quick question to go around the room with around about sectors or kind of focus areas. We talked about SaaS, talked about Chennai with SaaS. I think there we've talked about different regions or whatever. I think obviously the consumer aspect, but I'd be interested to hear. Obviously, AI is a big one. I think you talked about Bangalore being like a really strong place for AI, really specifically. It feels like generally India has grown out of being a SaaS, like enterprise SaaS capital, or it feels like that was obviously Zoho, Freshworks, those are some big names. Is that kind of the right thing to? Do you feel that the Indian ecosystem is expanding outside of that? Do you think that SaaS is still kind of the and it largely isn't. Everyone likes to talk about the new big thing, but B2B SaaS still pulls in a huge amount of dollars on like year over year. And then I guess so the growth out of SaaS, other things that you feel like maybe are on the come up, and then the last very final point, kind of where you feel the AI movement maybe is or isn't taking the Indian ecosystem.
Yeah, I'll go on sectors. I think what we're seeing is fintech today probably is the biggest sector. Fintech, consumer brands is doing well in India. Might differ from stage to stage, but fintech, consumer brands, then of course AI and SaaS. If I could lump it into one, like would be another one. I think these are really the three big sectors. SaaS is still very vibrant, might still be the second largest after fintech, but fintech's really, thanks to all the like UPI rails and a lot
Yeah.
of that. Fintech's an exciting. India is an exciting market for fintech. There's a lot of innovation here that's going around, which I mean you kind of see in markets like Brazil to a certain extent with PIX and all that. But
Yeah.
US still, I think Fed now, when it comes, it'll come. I think India is a much more vibrant market for innovation. Sorry,
Yeah.
one more.
Well, I
You want
just
to-
read today that Fed now does like $1 billion in real time payments a month. So it's getting up there.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. No,
You want
but
to take off after me? Sectors that you find
yeah.
interesting, go for it. Or
Yeah,
not.
yeah, I guess largely agree with Sajid that fintech and consumer brands has kind of been some of the larger sectors as of late. Like quick commerce, I think, has kind of changed the way that a lot of like at least affluent Indian consumers consume food and beverage or smaller consumer electronic products. Like for example, like before this panel, like I didn't have wired headphones, so like 30 minutes before the call started, I just bought these headphones, and they got delivered in 10 minutes for like $3. So I was like, I think like that kind of shift to like doing things last minute or not really having a pantry at home anymore has kind of changed the way a lot of Indians buy. So a lot of consumer brands have been utilizing that new channel to sell their products. I think on SaaS it's still very large, but I think even like 10 years ago, there were actually not a lot of venture firms who even had a SaaS specific team in their kind of investment team. So I think other than Excel, there was actually not a lot of like SaaS specialized investors until like 2018, 2019. So I think that's kind of like only more come up in the last 5 years than
Oh,
actually being something that's been fairly large in India historically.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I would broadly agree with both of them, and I would also add to consumer brands point, quick commerce is a major new channel, and also India's just per capita GDP is increasing. People have more money in their pockets. They're becoming more aspirational. And two of the best hits from my career in investing have both been consumer companies. One is a silver jewelry brand called Jiva, and there is now a fast fashion company called Numi. They both address like this aspiration that Indians have. Like people see other people have a better life on Instagram and they want that too. So if you can match that aspiration at that price point, usually works. And India just doesn't have those many brands. Like if I walk into a Walmart or a Costco, like let's say a deodorant, I'll have like 100 options to choose from in the US. Here you will have like six, seven. There's massive scope for like more brands to come up. The other sector I am specifically bullish on is deep tech. I feel like there's kind of like now there's this concept of an overdone window in politics where things become acceptable to say with time. Similar kind of thing happens with aspirations of founders. I feel like once people see that okay, I can go raise money for satellite company, the next idea is even crazier. So
Mm-hmm.
like for example, how Elon did PayPal first and then Tesla and then SpaceX, and you could see the level of ambition going up. I kind of sense that happening in India right now, where a bunch of like, for example, there's this really cool company called Ultra Human, again, Blume portfolio, which is built one of the best health trackers in the world. They're competing right up there, with and they got rated, I think, as the best in the world, and they're selling globally. It's basically a smart ring that you wear on your hand, and it tells you everything about your health. This kind of a hardware tech company coming out of India 5 years back would have been like unheard of, or even Pixel, like I said, or Pure Sight from our portfolio. These are very ambitious plans, which wouldn't get off the ground without a 20-30 million dollar check. And these founders are able to go raise that kind of money and build those products. And looking at them, other people are saying, hey, maybe even I could take a shot at this, maybe. So Ola Electric, for example, went public. It's an electric scooter company, just went public this week, had a massive pop in the IPO. Again, that guy started a company, built a factory, launched a scooter in like 2 years or something like that, and it became the fastest selling electric scooter in India. So these kind of hardware, deep tech, manufacturing companies are also increasingly becoming possible, and I think Indian founders are just becoming more ambitious to to take these attempts. That's the clear trend I'm seeing.
It's interesting to not hear you all, and maybe, and I guess this would be maybe a good final point. Is AI not as much of a, and I know that, and there's like the AI movement is very San Francisco heavy, like that's really, and is that the kind of the story where obviously everyone's aware of it, probably using the tools. I mean, it's in a lot of ways AI is just software, kind of more generally. If you're not, unless you're like building the models yourself, is but not as much of a hypey kind of cycle in India as it is in the US right now.
Yeah, it seems like there's not enough Indian companies to kind of like absorb AI capital and like
Yeah,
at least on the infrastructure side and kind of the like foundational model side, there's not
yeah,
really been like a lot of talent historically. They all end up being in the US from day one.
yeah.
And so I think it's largely been kind of on like the application layer, be it the
Hmm.
consumer side or the
Yeah,
enterprise
more
side.
and
But
more, using it, but you're not going to be. It's not.
Yeah.
an ecosystem that would be necessarily ready to pour, some crazy amount of money into a foundation model.
I like to joke that the best Indian founder building in AI is probably Arav Srinivas of Perplexity, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Yeah. So I don't think India is a deep enough market. I think that's the fundamental challenge.
To do these infra companies, you need like a heavy background in machine learning. You probably need a PhD or at least a master's, having worked in that space. And so people like Arvind who were good at that, after IIT, they went to the US, they did their masters there, and hence end up starting companies there. I have batchmates like who work at Meta's AI arm or OpenAI and so on. Right? All the nerds from my batch went on to do that stuff, and now they're starting AI companies in the US.
Yeah.
So we unfortunately lost that talent to the US. I don't think it's coming.
But yeah, that's interesting. Well, I really appreciate it. I know we went over. I think at least for me, it's a sign of interest, and I really appreciate the conversation. I think everyone who watched, I'm sure they do as well. So I really appreciate it. We'll get this final slide up here. Thanks again to Sakra for helping us put it together, and hope to talk to you all soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.